So I'm going to motivate the deck here in a second. I think for folks who had a chance to take a look, and it is posted online if you do want to look ahead. There's a lot of data in here, and we're going to spend a lot of time on the analysis, but I want to just start by introducing it. So what this presentation is going to show, and what we're going to kind of pick apart on a picture-by-picture basis, is the physical utilization of the Northwest transmission system. And you're going to see kind of a segment, in the middle where we break and talk about what the implications are for our current physical utilization. And what I want to start with is to underscore this: it is entirely possible, and you're going to see it's common, that you could have a transmission path, a key pinch point that is fully contractually encumbered, and we'll get into that in more detail, but has no additional long-term firm capacity to sell, but most or potentially all hours of the day and year there is available physical transmission. And if you think about kind of a paradigm where you have these kind of reservations for transmission, these through long-term firm contracts, and they're held broadly regardless of whether or not that capacity is used, that has a really important implication for planning, development, how you think about it, what resources can get on the grid, and so on. We're really going to focus on that planning piece here, but the implications are substantial. So, I have a diagram at the bottom to kind of characterize this another way. So what we're going to try to look at today is we know how big the pipes are. We also know how much of the pipes have been, sold for reservation. What we do not yet have a good look at, what we're going to look at here, is how much water is actually moving within them, and is there room for more? And then, how should we think about that in a planning context? So that's my brief introduction. I'm going to switch. For folks who were at the commission yesterday, Henry Tillman, transmission related, gave a long introduction about the story of Odysseus. I don't know anything about that, but what I do know about is up in Peninsula, Michigan. This is the place I call home. I bring my wife back there every year and kind of look to see if she's ready to move back. It's not going to happen. But there are 5 really great things about it. So, I can characterize it in this way. No matter how many times I pump it up, there will not ever be an overwhelming amount of California license plates moving through there. There'll never be traffic. We have traffic. Henry says he can do Odysseus again. No, thank you. So what I really want to emphasize about this and why I'm using this example is for this reason in particular. So it's a great place. There's traffic there. Sometimes, people drive, whatever. But there's really only traffic in the UP one time per year, and that is the day that everybody goes to college, which is up in the Northwest, kind of part of that. And that is it. Aside from that day, with all the parents coming from Wisconsin and lower Michigan, there is never, ever traffic there. So the analogy I want to use is something like this. So if you are up in that area and you use a car to get around, how would you want that one day per year traffic jam to be dealt with, right? So here's the first option. And, spoiler alert, this is what we do in the Northwest. So you use a model to determine, well, where might people be coming from and which highways are they going to get onto? And then you determine, well, how many cars could those highways support? And not just on a regular day, but even when they have, some roads out, whatever. So, for example, that could be 10,000 cars. And what you then do is you say, well, we know that our peak capacity is 10,000 cars, and we're going to create and sell just enough travel permits for that peak day, 10,000 cars. And we're going to send them long-term firm. Those people can drive in the middle of the night, 6 in the morning, anytime, 365 days per year. But only those people can drive that, permitting system. And anybody who didn't get those first 10,000 people, even if they want to drive, and they're happy to drive 364 days per year and just not on the other one, they're out of luck. There's no product that's available to them generally that can offer that. Instead, they have to kind of show up every day or every hour and request a short-term permit. That is what we do in the Northwest. That's how we market our transmission. On the other hand, the alternative, and I'll have a kind of a contrast for this, the alternative is you have a system with no permits, right? So as soon as you get a driver's license, which put another way is an interconnection request. As soon as you get that through, you can get on the road, and there's a system in place that provides kind of an economic signal to disincentivize you from traveling when there's high traffic. But most days, most hours, that signal says, go ahead. And just as a final note, you don't want to get in a situation where, you have a problem that's substantial, so you still have the ability to call someone and say, hey, you can't drive. It's not the Wild West there. So that's my initial introduction to kind of characterize what it is that how it is that we buy and sell transmission today, and kind of why it's worth then taking a look at. So we've sold all the permits, but how much is getting used? So now to jump to the motivation. So given that we are kind of in that former category.
Hey, Mike.
Yes.
Hi, this is Charlie Black. You're aware that in the Northwest and elsewhere, there is non-firm transmission available for times when the people who have acquired long-term firm or firm transmission aren't using it, or capacity is available, right?
Yeah. So thanks, Charlie. I had as kind of a sub note on the first one, which is, so for anybody who has those long-term firm reservations, they have rollover. They are not available for purchase for other folks. However, on a short-term basis, that if it's being unused, it's always available for sale to be used non-firm on a short-term basis. I'll talk a little bit later about whether or not that's good enough and what the implications are for that. But I think that's a good point to start with. That's what I was trying to describe in that last piece, which is if you don't have one of those permits, then you have to request something non-firm on a short-term basis over and over and over again. And I think what we'll talk about here is, is that enough to get something on the grid?
Right. Okay. Thank you.
So kind of motivating this, given a presumption, so given that we buy and sell permits rather than using a market signal, if you think about this from a planning context, and this is the motivation for us taking a look at this, if what you do when you're planning is you presume that resources can only be built where there's available long-term firm contract capacity, you put that into your model, you'll either get one of two things. One, your portfolio options are going to be super limited, right? So because if you have no long-term firm transmission access to an area with great wind potential, for example, you're never going to select that wind potential. Or alternatively, you might have a path to that wind resource that you could develop through some, investments in the transmission system that might not actually be required under some different operating paradigm. But that's what you fix yourself in when you think about it in that way. But on the other hand, there's this other way that we can do this, and this is actually quite typical for planning models, right? It's just a presumption. You let the model run, and models are able then to build resources, portfolio expansion models, wherever there's physical capacity. But that can overstate the reality of the on-the-ground situation. I think we run into this quite commonly in the Northwest. You have an IRP. The IRP does not take into account all aspects of that constrained transmission system, and it might indicate to you, look, go build an Eastern Oregon resource, and then you take a look, and there's not a great transmission product to bring that resource back to you. And so you run into a problem kind of on the flip side too. So for our work, thinking about, how do you bring this back in our work, an example I give is, what is the realistic potential for resource development in a particular area with existing infrastructure and our current transmission marketing paradigm? Or in other words, if we make one of those two choices above, and then how might that look with some transmission expansion or some different operating paradigm? So with all of that said, yep.
Yeah, a question, this is Fred Hewitt. So this may or may not be the best time to talk about this, but you can say whichever. But I'm wondering if you're aware, PacifiCorp in their IRP process has long included transmission expansion in their power planning, but they've recently added another feature to they use System Optimizer that allows their model to select, if they're building new, if the model thinks it might be good to add new wind or solar somewhere, the model will also be able to select from kind of a library of transmission, pieces to be able to bring those in, and they have the costing and all that built in as well. And I'm wondering if you've heard about that or, are thinking about something like that.
So I have heard of that. I think, Fred, it would be helpful. So my impression is just slightly different. Can you clarify when you're describing that it can pull from transmission pieces? Do you mean new builds or existing contracts, or can you kind of describe that?
For new builds, remember I was saying transmission expansion. So, all along they've been able to put in predefined pieces, like, for example, different parts of the energy gateway package of transmission lines, and they can plug them in, to a model run as they see fit. But this new approach allows the model to dynamically select new transmission, at least maybe not huge pieces, but, gen ties and other relatively shorter pieces. From a they have a kind of a library of transmission corridors or projects that the model can look at.
Yeah. Okay. So that's great. So I really appreciate you sharing that, Fred. That was my understanding too. What I want to I'll kind of try to restate what Fred just said in a second, where I think it's super relevant. Great time to bring it up. But what I want to try to emphasize here is actually, so it could be the case that you need to pair your new resource with some expansion, and it's nice to incorporate that in the model, right? Or it could be the case that you just need to think about the transmission that's available in a different way. And I think where we're at right now, in on the ground reality is, we think about in our models, we kind of assume that anything's available to the extent that it's not physically utilized in the model, and then the on the ground reality is we kind of go back to the former, which is if you can't get a contract for capacity, you have to do some expansion, and there might be something in the middle. So I want to so that all makes sense to me because I'm intimately familiar with this, but I want to spend a little more time doing some introductions on this stuff before I spend more time on that, just for folks who aren't as familiar with this. So let's kind of thinking about this and getting to the data here, let's open up the system and see if, considering these couple of options and also the one that Fred threw in here, if we can make kind of some educated judgments about, which approach makes sense and what the implications are from that. So, but first, I want to just do a couple of initial definitions. So this is a plot. I think a lot of people have seen this. It's from BPA, it's their flow gates and main stem transmission lines across the Pacific Northwest. So you can see Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana here. Just a few definitions that I would add to this. First, I want to just define, since we talked about a lot, what a bilateral contract is. I think concept of market is relatively straightforward, and I'll expand on it later. But when you think about a contract, it could be for transmission rights, for energy, for resource adequacy, capacity. If you think about a contract for energy, it could be like a bilateral deal for price stability. You buy some energy for a year out from now to give yourself a little hedge about what the deal with some uncertainty about that. In the case of transmission, it's really a utility goes out or a resource owner goes out and contracts to secure a reservation to transfer energy on the transmission system. And normally when we talk about that in the Northwest, we're talking about doing that on a long-term firm basis. You have a slice of the pipe. It's yours to use or not any time of the day. You can only access on a short-term basis if that other person isn't using. So now there's this other concept that we need to talk about, which is a point of receipt or a point of delivery. So pour-pod pair is basically where you say you're going to pick up the energy and where you're going to drop it off. And the kind of path that it follows in between them is called the contract path. So I'm going to drop that on here as kind of an image here. So you might have a point of receipt somewhere out in Montana. That would be like a very specific substation. You might have a point of delivery, at some particular substation back west. More commonly, it's just to a utilities contiguous service territory. You have a contract path that's in the middle. What we haven't talked about yet is, is how the power actually moves through that, because you're not going to be granted a contract path just because you like to, you can draw a line across certain particular transmission lines that have capacity. When they actually grant you the contract path, before they do that, you're opening up the hood and taking a look at where that physical energy transfer takes place. So that's just the contract path is just a simplification of that. So I want to give an analogy for folks who maybe aren't electrical engineers. So Up on the left is a water tower. Continue my UP theme, that's actually a town in the Peninsula of Michigan. Escanaba has a university and no great passy places. If you're ever in town, just skip it. But if you imagine that you have a point of receipt of water there, and you have a point of delivery in your kitchen sink, you know, you have this pipe system. I mean, clearly, some of the water that comes out of your faucet will have taken whatever the path of least resistance is, the most direct path. All right, so I'm going to overlay that. That would be something like the contract path. But obviously, some of it probably took the meandering route also. You know, and you don't know, but if you were in charge of making sure that you are not overloading this system, you know, you want to take a look at that before you grant that access. That's kind of the fundamental concept. So to move that to more of a kind of electrical engineering point of view, so I've got a couple kind of rules of the power flow road up here. This is a generalization. I don't think we need to get super, super deep. But what I want to emphasize is this, which is, you know, you might have a point of receipt, for example, in Eastern Oregon. And just to say, I've tried to kind of spread the level a little bit from Oregon and Washington, et cetera, because I'm not trying to pick on anyone, so everybody, trying to ding everybody here. So you might have a point of receipt in Eastern Oregon, and you want to drop it off somewhere in Portland. But the way that, and you know, look, I mean, every blue line is a transmission line, but the way that power actually moves between one area on its way to the other, it turns out that it's based on the resistance of the power lines in between. And we're not going to spend a huge amount of time on here, but I want to share this so people can understand, because it does come up and it has incredibly important implications. So look, so if you think about this here, I have a kind of a small animation. If I have that kind of path on the, or that point of receipt, it is the yellow star on the right, and I'm thinking about dropping it off in the green. So you might think, well, what you should do, of course, is take the most direct path, you know, through the kind of the Bend area, across the Cascades on that southern route, and then just drop off in the Southwest Portland metro area. And, you know, it's very likely that that's where most of the energy is going to go. But the reality is some of it is also going to go up and around and through Seattle and back down through south of Boston, which is remarkable, but that is what it will do. So I'll add that across here. Oopsie, I'll add that across here. So the thing about this and why this happens is because, and you cannot control this, it is up to nobody. It happens the same way every day of the year, regardless of what's going on the grid. And in fact, we know this so well that you can look it up in advance. What this really comes down to is power travels along the path of least resistance. And so some of that power is going to come across these big, you know, 500 kV lines that are shorter, and then some of it will still go up and around. That's just the way that it's going to be. So if you look at this particular example, I actually pulled out the numbers from kind of the spreadsheet that we can look up in advance. So if you take a look down here, so if you look down here, so we have this example I just described, Eastern Oregon and Southwest Metro. So about 40% of the energy goes across the Southern Cascades. About 30% of it comes just right down, you know, up a little bit more and then down through the gorge. And then about 15% of it goes up through the Washington Cascades, you know, into the Seattle area, and then all the way down through south of Boston. And this is why we have this problem sometimes where, look, you know, why can't I get capacity from Eastern Oregon and drop it off in Portland? Well, it's because 15% of your energy is coming through south of Austin, where maybe it's full, right? So you know, so this is again to kind of motivate the idea of the flow of power through the Northwest and how it is that what we have to think about in order to obtain transmission rights, and how we have to think about this stuff from a conceptual standpoint in planning. Okay, so just one last slide. I'm not going to hit all these first bullet points 1, 2, and 3. It's a restatement of the last one. I just want to emphasize the fourth point, which is this, which is, so since you can't tell power where to go, you know, since it's based on the resistance of the lines and that does not change, you have to do one of two things. You have to either make an economic signal that's strong enough to turn a generator off when it's going to overload a line, right? Or, and this is what we do instead, you have to be sure that you have limited the amount of firm rights that you've sold on a specific path, such that you avoid any potential overloads, even in a contingency scenario, right? So, and what you need to recognize, and this is, you know, I'm not saying it's good or bad, I'm just saying it's what we do up here, is Given what we do, you have to recognize that you are rigidly guarding against the worst case, even though most days and hours, number one, don't have a contingency, and number two, aren't heavy flow days. So this is very similar to that kind of car and traffic analogy that I had earlier. But it's why I think it's important background when you think about, so our next slides are going to start to open the hood on how much energy is actually moving to the Northwest. And I just wanted to try to emphasize, look, there's a reason that you're not seeing these lines tapped out every single day. A part of it is that every day is not a peak day. Another part of it is we only sell enough so that resources have, the security to be built and be developed to the extent that, we don't oversell our system, and that can lead to resources, economic resources not being built and selling over these paths. All right, so I'm going to get into Western Washington power flow. But before I do, I want to take any questions that we have so far.
Well, this is Fred. Just to note one thing, which is that there are some, and I'm not an engineer, so I won't talk about the specifics, but I think there are some techniques for moving power flow around a little bit. For example, I know Bonneville has looked at the possibility of doing that for the south of Alston path, phase shifters or other equipment, but the options may not be, it may have some limitations, and the cost may be an aspect of it. So, but I think in general, what you're saying is correct.
So, okay, so I appreciate that, Fred. Let me just restate that really quickly. So I made the statement that you cannot tell power flow where to go. There are two things that BPA has done on south of Alston. One is they tried to do basically a redispatch where they just pick a resource, they turn down a resource that was going across south of Alston, and they replace it with power from a resource that doesn't. So that's not what Fred was talking about. What Fred was talking about is there are these commercially available products that you can buy that actually what they do is they change the resistance of a line. So you kind of just bump it up and say, look, power, don't look over here, go look over in this other area. I think BPA piloted that, but it ultimately wasn't implemented further. But that's really, there is some product for that. But it's not broadly used on the BPA system. And then one other question that I saw, there's a couple ones. So one of the questions is from the chat. The question was, can you go back to the deck?
Yeah.
Thank you. The question was, are you using the wrong mouse?
Am I using the wrong mouse? Oh my gosh.
So we've got a little, okay. All right, so the one question was, is this loop flow? And this is not loop flow. So it's a great question. So sometimes you can have the case where you are intending to, so in the worst possible case, I'll give you an example. We looked at this at some class I had in grad school. There's the Indian power system. And in their case, kind of the wiring in their system is so kind of interconnected and often, there's so many wires that the planning of the power system in India might not have been as strategic as the Portland metro area, for example. And so you can have power that is trying to get to A to B, and it's just like looping all around and around and around and around to the extent that like 30 or 40 or in some cases up to 50% of power is basically just burning around in a circle on its way from one place to another. It's not often that bad, but it's that bad in some urban areas. This is actually fundamental, totally normal and typical for any power system anywhere. It is just a product of the resistance of these lines. If you have a project, for example, in Montana and you want to deliver energy to Portland, a good chunk of that energy is going to go through Seattle and then through south of Alston and down into Portland, which is one of the things that keeps those resources from being able to be developed. Okay, I think I saw one other thing in here.
Ken? Dave Levy had some comments.
Okay. All right, so I'm just going to take 1 second here to read a comment. Okay, I'm going to come back to this in a second here.
And Ken Dragoon had a comment at the bottom too.
Oh gosh. Okay. Yeah. So okay. Well, so a couple comments here. Not bad comments. They're helpful comments, but I'm going to just reserve them for a second because they're kind of additional nuance. I think it's worth taking a look at some of the data here for folks who don't live and breathe this stuff. So here we go. And I will come back to these. Just
get rid of the chat. I'll pull it up on mine.
Okay.
So you can
That'd be
see it
great.
here.
Okay. All right, so let's take a look under the hood in Washington. So I'm just going to have this slide up just briefly, and then we'll look at this in kind of a more condensed view. So this again is, this is the BPA transmission grid. They operate almost all of the transmission in the Northwest. That's why I focus on them. There are other providers here too. Obviously there are transmission lines in Eastern Oregon. I'm going to just basically put a condensed version of this on the next slide instead, where I just kind of try to characterize. So here's, this is Washington, just Washington, and I've used red lines here to try to show where the main transmission lines are. So you can see you have a kind of a red transmission line coming out of Vancouver, BC into Washington. Have one kind of further to the east. You have another, that eastern part comes from Montana. And you have these two lines that come from the Grant and Douglas counties over into Seattle area. That's the Cross Cascades north. What I wanted, and then of course the bottom line there is through the gorge into Portland, and then that kind of right line on the very bottom is going to California. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about that. Don't need to worry about it too much right now. But what I want to just emphasize here, just in a general sense, I'm going to show the details here in a second, but what I want to emphasize in a general sense is this. If you think about, so I've got these arrows here, they're roughly scaled by the amount of energy that flows in these particular places and the general or consistent direction that it travels. So if you start with that dark blue box on the right, so you think about like the upper, mid, upper Columbia projects. So the mid-Columbia projects are always, and other resources to the east, Colstrip and elsewhere, are always 100% of the time pushing flow west or towards the ocean, east to west. And their flow actually, we'll show this, is the lowest in the summer. It kind of makes sense, less water. If you flip that and take a look up at the lighter blue color Vancouver, BC area, I have two heads on that arrow because in the summer, the Vancouver, BC area exports into the Northwest and then down through to California. I think that's pretty well known. I think it's probably overstated how much they're sending. That's why that arrow is not that big. And then in the winter, Vancouver is an importer. We send the Vancouver area energy typically in the winter. I've got this line, next one, green, right in the central Seattle area. Not that there's a big generator there, it's just a point that's monitored for reliability. That's all the flow gates are. It's just a collection of lines that typically flows tend to go in the same direction, and you want to group them together just for analytical purposes, nothing else. But so there's a kind of a monitoring point in the central Seattle, central Puget Sound area. And what that shows basically is, in the winter, it, tends to go south to north because energy is being pushed up through that into Vancouver, BC. And then in the winter, the total net flows in the Seattle area tend to be, more or less light. You have energy obviously coming into the Seattle area, but not so much that it's being pushed, either into Vancouver or down around there. It more or less consumes all the energy that's entering that area. We'll look at that in a second. And then, of course, I think a lot of people know that you have a number of thermal plants kind of in that Olympia, Tacoma area, and then also you have this power transmission line that comes south of Seattle, right? So some energy is coming across that, not going into Seattle, and just continuing down south through Portland and California. So in general, the flows kind of in that Olympia, Tacoma area are north to south pretty much all the time, lightest and sometimes even reversed, heading north in late summer and fall. That kind of makes sense. You think about what our loads look like and what energy resources are out there. We'll look at that in a little more detail in a second here. But those are the themes. The themes are, east to west across the Cascades 100% of the time. Vancouver imports from us in the winter, and they export to us in the summer. The Seattle area is neutral most of the year, a little bit heading in that kind of south-north direction in the winter. And then, the Olympia area is always sending energy to Portland. And we'll try to build this up in detail. So now I'm going to show you guys a graph that I love, and I'm sure you'll learn to love it by the end of this call, but it's a little bit unwieldy at first. So this is some data analysis that I did. For folks who went to grad school, you might notice that it looks like MATLAB, and that's because it is. Much to the dismay of our division director, I still use that sometimes. So I've got this box at the bottom that explains it if you don't like to listen or prefer to read. But basically, how I would characterize this is like this. So let's just break down this picture. So you have 12 different colored shaded areas. Each of them represents a month. So I've called out March. So you have the first month is June or January, then February, then March, April, May, and then that kind of first green color is June, then July. So you can kind of see the summer go on, and then we end again there in December. So each color is a month. And what the shaded area represents, so you'll notice, like, for example, let's pick that yellow area. So that's August, and I've got these kind of boxes at the top describing it. What this is, just take a second to think about it. What you're looking at here is what the flow looked like on a typical day in August. So, for example, that first kind of the start of the yellow shape is what the power flow typically was around midnight. The kind of the dip you see in the middle of the day is showing that in general on this particular path. This is the Vancouver, BC area into Washington. So what this is showing is in general the flows kind of dip off a little bit, typically on an August day, and then they pick back up in the evening. So think about this. So I had described that the Vancouver, BC was a net importer in the winter and a net exporter in the summer. We send them energy in the winter, they send us energy in the summer. So how is that reflected in here? Well, if you look here, so here's kind of the end of winter months, right? So March. The flow is negative in general in March throughout the entirety of the day, meaning it's heading from the south to north direction. We are sending it to them. And on the other hand, the easier example is, so this is August. So in a typical August day in the year 2017, they were sending us energy shaped like this. Then the last thing I want to add is these kind of bird-looking things up here. This is the typical system operating limit, or in other words, what the transmission line could have typically allowed in that day. So this delta here, right, is unused physical transmission capability. Now, there might be one day in August of 2017 where it was higher, might be. But what I did in making this is I looked at every single, midnight to 1 a.m., every single 1 to 2, and just averaged what each hour was for, for the month, and put it in this kind of diagram here. So before so let me read this thing to the right real quick. So characterizing this is called the south of Custer flow gate. That's what the kind of intertie with the BC area, the Vancouver, BC area is called. So in general, I've said this a couple times now, they send energy north to south in the summer. They import it south to north in the winter. It's highest during peak. So the highest north to south loading is during peak export from BC in spring and summer, and it's often correlated really strongly with heavy California, Oregon intertie flows. Kind of makes sense. They push the most energy through the Northwest when they want to sell it down to California because the price signal is there. I'll talk about this TTC thing in just one second. Before I do, I want to just pause, see if anyone has any good questions or comments to try to explain this to their colleagues, other folks on the phone, if this wasn't totally clear. So there's a good comment here from Angela at the CPC, I think, or CEC. Yeah, that's right. So she says, well, what does it mean to have an average operating limit? Well, what that means is this is, so take this August day again. So the typical system operating limit was about 3,000 megawatts in the morning, and for whatever reason, doesn't matter what, it happens to typically drop off in the day. The reason why I say average is because this is a analysis of the real actual data of August of 2017, and it very well could have been the case that, for example, for one single hour, for whatever reason, maybe there was an outage or whatever, for 1 hour in that data set, it was lower or higher. But when you take that together with every other hour and day in that month, this is what it looks like. So when I kind of look at this, the way I think about this is I look at this and I say, oh yeah, look, okay, typically in March, they're taking power from us. That's why it's negative. They take a lot of it in kind of the midday and overnight, and less so in the shoulders. And then I look, in October, for example, say, oh, in October, probably they are out of water just like we are, and so they don't send much. And we don't give them much either. Okay, other comments. So I would just want to make one quick thing. So Fred has some comments on here in the chat about south of Alston. We'll get to south of Alston. Really great analysis that Fred has done. I want to talk about it when we get there, but it's a little bit later on.
Hey, Mike, this is Jeff Kugel from PNGC Power.
Yeah, go ahead.
My only comment, I like the graph. It's a really great graph. But PowerX has incredible storage in their hydro projects up north, and that's why they buy all of our cheap energy in Q2 when the flows are up north, and then they send it back to us for double, triple the prices in the summertime, because they basically have a huge battery up in their system. And so it would be interesting using that to see what happens if you overlay prices and the average price on this graph, just to kind of see, because that's really what they're following is economics. And then the only other comment is reminding you that the BPA transmission ran a demand response pilot, so they cut TTC on a planned basis in 2017 and 2018 in July, August, and September. So that could be a reason for the afternoon dips in the TTC numbers.
Oh, so I don't know that I knew that. So they had a DR pilot up in the northern tie, the left half of the northern tie.
Not in the northern tie, but I don't know if that affected the TTC along that route. I don't know, but maybe just something to remember, be aware of.
So I think that was great commentary. I actually did. So when I was originally looking at this, I did add price to this for exactly that reason. I think that's a really good story, an important one. I'll see if I can. Let's see if I can.
It might muddy the water too. So I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. Yep. Yeah. So I have all this just for anybody who says, "Well, what's 2017 have to do with anything?" So we can look at this across, and I've already done the data analysis across it. Every year for 20 years. Actually, I took 8 sample years that were similar in water and had some extreme years in water. Can definitely show that kind of towards the end of this thing. This is just meant to be illustrative, and it is broadly illustrative. Okay, so that was great comment. I appreciate that. Any other comments? Anybody just willing to say, look, I don't get this. Here's what I don't understand about your figure.
Hey, this is Ken Dragoon. Is this an example of a fully contractually subscribed path?
So thank you, Ken. So here is the one piece that I was said I would hold on for 1 second. So the TTC. So you're going to hear a couple. So depending on, basically how long you've been in the game, you might hear TTC, you might hear SOL. So TTC is the total transfer capability. The system operating limit is the SOL. They basically broadly define how much the path could have carried, maximum limit. So typically it's a thermal limit. You don't want to overload the lines thermally. Right now, the current TTC is 1850 megawatts. And there's a couple hundred megawatts of inventory on that right now. One thing I just want to mention is all these long-term firm inventory numbers that I have here are current as of when I originally did this work, which was maybe 2-3 months ago. And also they reflect the updates that BPA made. So there are some cases here, and I don't want to belabor this actually too much. There are some cases where, for example, one that everybody will be familiar with if you work in this world is, I'm going to show later in my slides south of Alston, and it'll say, oh, look, there's TTC on south of Alston. Well, everybody knows that for a long time there was no TTC on south of Alston, no long-term firm inventory to be sold on south of Alston. That's why we almost spent, $1 billion+ to build a path around it. Bonneville did some, reanalysis, changed some of their assumptions, and on that basis, we're able to expand the amount of long-term firm transmission they're offering. That's reflected in these numbers I have. It could very well be the case that, a year ago there was zero. But so now, just to re-summarize what I just said, the TTC is how much the lines could handle. By practice in Northwest, we sell long-term firm transmission basically up to the typical TTC. And the inventory for long-term firm transmission on this particular segment is a couple hundred megawatts. That wouldn't get you to Portland, just gets you to the end of this particular flow gate. But that's what it was. Again, you have to check Oasis to know what it is at this moment, this second, but that's what it was a few months ago.
So this is Fred. If I could just add one quick point to that. Bonneville updates their internal path ATC and available transmission capability I think once a year they publish it, but I know that they're continuously looking at this. And I'm looking at the last release, which was from last August. And south of Alston, for example, has about, for 2020, has about 313 megawatts of ATC, and goes up in the future in part because the Centralia units, which are north of Alston, start going offline. They publish those, I think, for all of their internal paths, not for the intertie, the northern, eastern, and southern intertie, as far as I know.
Right. Yep. Okay. So it's a great point, Fred. They do post their available ATC. It's also, anybody who buys it at any time, it can go away. But that's a really good point. There are two things I want to emphasize here. So one is another great question from Angela, which is, so why is it that our system operating limit is above the TTC? The reason is this. It is actually very common that the system operating limit is well above the TTC. The reason is because we do not have term system operators. We do not have term long-term firm. I talk about this at the very end, but it's something like this. If you buy if Bonneville sells you long-term firm transmission, that is your right to send that much energy in the direction that they sell it to you, north to south or whatever. That is your right to send it any time of the year, any day of the week, winter, summer, fall, any time. And it just happens that some paths have different typical limits depending on the year or season. And that's the reason why you can end up with these cases where, you look at the data, physically we should be able to, sell more. Actual reality, maybe that month, but not all year. That's how we sell transmission long-term firm. That's really something I want to emphasize here. This is, I'm glad we're having this discussion about this. When you buy and sell transmission in this way, you are locked into this because this whole kind of, thing where by definition that you are going to undersell your transmission system because you have to be because the rights that you do sell have to be available to people 24/7, 365 every year in the future. It's quite a crystal ball to try to have. And I think what people end up doing is they say, well, we'll be conservative, which look, I can appreciate that. Okay, so I am going.
Mike?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Charlie again. I've been looking through your slide deck here, and I don't see any reference to conditional firm transmission. Bonneville has started offering that on a limited basis, and it's a third option here in addition to the long-term firm and non-firm transmission. It's actually something that Invenergy has been supporting as a mechanism for providing transmission access under certain defined circumstances. That could be time of year. You mentioned that, I think you might have mentioned that south of Alston tends to be congested in very limited circumstances in the summer, but the rest of the time it's pretty much available. And there's other forms of conditional firm transmission service. So I guess the suggestion here is that you consider that as another alternative here.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Charlie. So you're jumping ahead to slide 43. I think we're on slide 13. I don't mind, but I just want to mention if you're thinking about, well, what products am I thinking about here? So first of all, just a quick statement. I think we're thinking about this from a planning perspective, but that is really important on the commercial side. What Charlie's describing is Bonneville does offer a product in some locations. They do not offer it at the interties, just since we're here, called the conditional firm product. The way that that's framed is like this. They will grant you a long-term firm contract. It will be curtailed, so if the line starts to fill up, it'll be curtailed, after those kind of non-firm folks. One of the problems with their current conditional firm offering is the conditions, while your contract goes on for 20 years, the security around the conditions is only consistent for 2 years. So Bonneville can change the conditions every 2 years. You might like them initially, you might hate them later. That's a problem, but that is one product that can help to alleviate some of this long-term firm thing. I don't think, actually, I've had some conversations, I don't know the numbers on this, but I don't think it's a very heavily utilized product in the system right now, in part because of where it's limited to being able to be used. All right, so so we spent a lot of time on this Vancouver, BC one. I want to jump to the same kind of slide, but looking now at Eastern Washington. I've called out again March, June, August. This is the same data, right? So this is the cross Cascades. It's coming from the Mid-Columbia piece, those two lines crossing the Cascades in Washington. So what you see here again, right, is a big delta between kind of where that shaded area is and where those lines are, meaning that in general we are not transmitting as much energy as could. Look, that's not in and of itself a problem, because we don't always need all the energy. Not every day is a peak day. But what we don't know, and we'll get to this later, is whether or not it might have been economic to have some other resource pushing energy down there. We just don't have access to it. And just one other thing I want to emphasize here, which is small animation. So all of this white space, I've mentioned this before, but all the white space between this physical limit, which is the upper line, and this actual utilization, which is the shaded area, that is thousands of megawatts of unused transmission capacity, in this case on a critical path with limited commercial inventory. So the TTC across the northern Cascades is 10,000 megawatts-ish. There is an inventory of long-term firm transmission. It's about a few hundred megawatts. BPA has released in part because of some upgrades on Cooley that are going to be taking place over the next 10 years. So they knew that they could reliably offer a transmission product for at least 10 years across that. But, just think about it. There is a lot of it, all of our, a large part of our resources, in particular all of our renewable resources that serve, the Puget Sound area, the Willamette Valley, they're on the other side of the mountains. So to the extent that we are close to full after 10 years from now, that's worth contemplating. It's definitely something that we have to be thinking about in our portfolio modeling, right? Because, if we're making a plan and it says, hey, go build Eastern Washington, solar or whatever, like that, the market might tell you a different answer. That's my point there. Now, I have one new plot here, and I just want to describe it briefly. What you see here along the x-axis, these are years. So this is the year, I don't remember, 2000, I think it must be 2005, 2006, whatever, all the way till 2018. And what the y-axis shows is the percent of time that there's some level of transmission available. It's actually hard to break this out here because there's basically always multiple hundreds or thousands of megawatts available, but I've got, a line here for 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, and even 600 megawatts. And basically what you see is, even though we don't have 600 plus megawatts of long-term firm inventory, and in fact before this we basically had none, we always or almost always have at least that much physically available. That's what this plot is showing. And by the way, the data is only on the years where there's a dot. So I've showed it continuously, but for example, I didn't look at one of the years in here just because I wanted to limit the amount of time I spent on the analysis here. We're not buying and selling anything, so I don't have to get this exactly right. I'm trying to look at the themes. So anyway, that's the kind of what I would try to characterize this plot as. Is it's just showing that basically 100% of the time there's at least 600 megawatts across the last 15 years. Okay, across a sample of years in the last 15 years, to be clear. Okay, so now I want to describe that southwest Puget Sound area. This is the Tacoma, Olympia area. The path that I'm looking at here is Raver Paul, and here you can see a little bit more. And really, so just to say, I'm basically boxing in the Puget Sound area. That's why I picked what I picked, right? So north, east of them, and then now this is south of them. And we're gonna do the same thing to Portland. So if you're feeling bad in Seattle, not picking on you, picking on everybody. So same plot, right? So I think the plot will make a lot of sense when you think about what resources are delivering energy across here. It's mostly hydro resources. They mostly run out of water during this time of year. So it makes a lot of sense that there's, huge amount of unused capacity in these late summer months. This path tends to peak in the winter, and it mostly serves that Northwest Washington, Puget Sound area. Right now, the total limit is about 1450, but after some upgrades and Centralia retires, probably there'll be some additional inventory. But right now, there's I think 60 megawatts. Can't remember, something, not a lot. This is an example of a path where so this is an example of a path. You look at the data where it is the case that, so if you grab this 600 megawatt line, there are years, sure, there are definitely years where there's 600 megawatts available. For example, this year 90% of the time, and then the very next year there's 600 megawatts available only 80% of the time. And then so now here's 500 megawatts, 400, 300. So basically, there's always at least 100 or 200 megawatts 100% of the time. And this shows, looking at each 15-minute interval, the extent to which that's a systemic thing, a conditional thing, kind of what that is. Okay, so that boxes in the Washington area. So let me have some summarizing thoughts here about this kind of data set. So thinking about Western Washington, yeah, there's definitely some newly created long-term firm inventory up in that area. Some of it's only available for 10 years. But on the other hand, setting aside the idea of or not taking, for granted, not taking it as law that you have to think only in terms of whether or not there's firm transmission, in part because in our modeling, pretty much nobody does think about it in that context. On most days and hours, there's really substantial unused transmission capacity. And again, that makes sense. Most days aren't peak days, but also by design, we undersell our system, by design. And this is the piece that I'm trying to kind of hit at on this last part, which is, the energy being delivered is probably a least cost dispatch of what's available, what's on the grid, and what a utility has either owned or under contract. But it's not necessarily a least cost dispatch of the entire footprint, meaning, you don't really know if there might be a cheaper resource that could either be delivered that's existing or could be built and be delivered across these paths that have limited commercial inventory because they're not getting developed, because there's not a lot of commercial inventory. So two kind of takeaway thoughts here. So one is, look, unused physical capacity, while it might not make sense, might seem counterintuitive, when you look under the hood, it says basically nothing about commercial inventory. It is absolutely the case that you can have hundreds of megawatts of unused physical capacity with very limited or no commercial inventory. So then taking that to the next step, right, and this is the planning piece, is so it is entirely common for a request for proposal from some new development to either prefer or mandate or whatever long-term firm transmission. So if you think about that in an era of limited commercial transmission inventory, what we don't know when resources are being built and when we're running our planning models, we really don't know if it's the least cost energy. It's definitely the best thing based on what our models say. Oh, look, here's some great cost-effective opportunity for Eastern Oregon. Here's some great cost-effective opportunity for Montana. We don't know if we're getting that, or if what we're getting is just whatever's the best available resource that bids into that based on the fact that they have transmission. We don't know. We don't know. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears for a second here and talk about this in a kind of a broader sense, compare the way we do it to how market does, and then I'm going to come back to Oregon. It's a little bit of a narrative, but I just thought people could probably use a break from looking at this. Questions or comments before I get into the idea of contrast between what we do and how it might look under market or under some other operating paradigms?
Well, this is Fred. Just to note, and not an area that I'm fully an expert in, is that some of the capacity that a given entity might have bought from Bonneville or whoever, some of the transmission rights can be, and often are, resold, close to the operating hour. It's kind of like if you have a, football game, you have season ticket holders, you have people who buy a few weeks ahead, and you have people walking up to the box office. But then you have a secondary market, like StubHub or whatever. There are ways to address the underutilization of the capacity, and some of those are already in operation.
So just my quick counter comment to that, not to carry this example too far, and broadly, I agree with you here on this idea, Fred, but here's the difference. The difference is no one's going to book a plane ticket, rent a car, and rent a hotel, hoping that when they show up, someone's got a ticket that they want to buy. And that's really what I'm getting at with that kind of difference between the operational reality and the planning reality.
Well, I have weird friends who do that, and, sometimes they don't get in.
We believe you, Fred.
Yeah. We're not on mute, Chad. All right. So other dialogue that people want to share at this time. Any comments, questions? I know I've just unloaded a lot, and I want to take your feedback so far.
Ken Dragoon here. So this is something that, if I understand what you're saying correctly, maybe I should check that. There seems to be a lot of physical capability to move energy that goes unused because Fred doesn't have enough friends who want to walk up and buy transmission at last minute, and also because you often can't finance projects if you don't have firm transmission. At least here in the Northwest, that seems to be the case. So I want to confirm that that's what you're saying, that there's a lot of unused transmission because contractually maybe it's all obligated, but physically not. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's a trend you could definitely observe. I would support that in some areas. Obviously, there are some areas where there's unused transmission because no one's there. But yeah, in a broad sense, that could be one of the reasons that you see a limited availability of transmission.
Right. So we've seen really even small, almost de minimis solar projects not able to get on the line because they don't have access to firm transmission on lines that probably look a lot like this. So I would just underscore that if that's the problem you're laying out there for us, I would agree that seems to be a huge hindrance to a lot of project development in the Northwest, potentially very low cost projects.
Yep. Yeah, and also, and really, again, to just emphasize, like, the council's kind of role in this, there's another part, which is we want to ensure that when we have a plan, we want to have an understanding of whether or not, or at least a dialogue about the implications for this on-the-ground reality. Is our plan implementable or not? What are the implications of that? Implementable, like in a commercial sense. All right. So,
Mike, this is Jeff Kugel from PNGC again. I just wanted to also mention that as part of this new TC20 Bonneville rate case that just kind of wrapped up here last year, they are implementing like a conditional firm product, which kind of addresses exactly what you're saying, that, outside of, 8 to 20 hours a year, they have fully grantable firm transmission. So they are trying to address this in the conditional firm product, which basically is a non-firm product that is basically first in line to firm up, months before delivery, or however, with the caveat that you can get cut during those limited set of hours where you're bumping up against TTC.
Yep. And I think when I talked about that earlier, I just wanted to emphasize this piece, which is an important piece. One, the terms on conditional firm are only firm for 2 years, and then they can change at any point, or to anything. And then the second one is conditional firm is not offered everywhere, in particular not on the ties.
Yeah.
But it is a good point, and hopefully they can get some more traction on it. Okay. All right. So let's go into this kind of second piece of the conversation here, and we'll come back to look at the physical utilization once we're worn out of this idea. So what I was showing previously is kind of the difference between the available long-term. So what I was showing previously was the difference between the physical utilization and what we have as long-term firm, available transfer capability. So just so everyone's familiar with these kind of very common phrases, last week we talked about TTC for the total limit, ATC, which is how much they could sell. So thinking about this idea generally, not focus specifically on those last couple slides, because you're going to see it's not common, it's pervasive, or it's not uncommon. That scenario I showed is very common. So the question really is, this gets back to our original idea. It's a restatement, actually, of the ideas that I had at the very beginning, right? So should a planning model assume that an intermittent resource could be built and used at physical capacity whenever it's available for shorter-term purchase? This is what everybody's planning models do today. They have a bulk, kind of a blob, and with a stick and bubble, and so long as that stick doesn't get overflowed, the resource expansion model will say, oh, that's fine, even if in reality there's no long-term firm transmission. So that's a planning question. The second one, to add nuance, is that actually realistic, for developers to finance? So there's been some conversation about this. I don't think I'm saying anything controversial when I say developers probably cannot finance a product on non-firm, maybe could finance it on conditional firm. So then this last piece is, or second piece is, so if there's some long-term firm transmission capacity and it's already held by an intermittent resource, we know this is the case. There are absolutely solar and wind plants that are out there right now with long-term firm transmission across important paths, even though they're intermittent, right? So you have that case where you know that an intermittent resource, which you might not even give any capacity value, is holding that, kind of precious transmission capacity. But you might, utility, for example, or the region, might be in a position where they're projecting a shortage and they have a capacity need. And so the question is do we have to do transmission expansion, right, to accommodate that new capacity resource? Or is there some way, and I don't have a great answer for this, but is there some way to recognize that, look, if you have a capacity need, you can take advantage of the fact that if your wind's not blowing or sun's not shining, that transmission is then available for that capacity resource to meet its obligation, right? So is there a way to kind of accommodate that fact without having to do expansion? Okay, so let's kind of think about how this is executed in other areas. So I want to compare a bilateral, kind of the Northwest, somewhere with the market. I don't know if I ever characterize this as the California ISO's market because it's so broad that I might have details wrong. That I want to have someone call me out on that. But it's what I've got. All these slides are generally framed after the ISO. Other markets are different. But I want to just pick on this green resource here, where I've got these kind of different potential resources organized by their dispatch price. And so the green resource is like a hypothetical brand new resource with a cost that's kind of in the middle. It's a little bit lower than maybe that yellow one. Could be gas. Yellow could be gas. Red could be coal. Or less efficient gas, for example, and then the blue maybe is a hydro project, something like that. So the question is, well, so if you're going to build this new resource, this gets at the, kind of that discussion we were having earlier, thinking about, well, what's the right path forward for planners? So how would this resource compete in a market, and what about it in the Northwest? So let's start with the market. So in a market, I think there's...
Hey, Mike?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Charlie again. I'm sorry to stop you here, but the market, we have a market in the Northwest, and it is a bilateral market. There are other forms of markets like ISOs and RTOs, but I'm just kind of getting stuck a little bit on the lack of recognition that we have a bilateral market in the Northwest.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point. I'll keep that in mind if I ever reuse these slides or whatever. Probably good to recognize that people can trade bilaterally, but we don't have so I was actually just talking to Fred about this. Fred doesn't want to call, doesn't want to refer to things as the ISO or RTO because they have particular conversations. What did you want to call it? MO, Fred? I don't remember. But anyway, I was trying to be sensitive to the fact that there's connotations associated with that, but I'll come up with something better. Let's just put it this way. I'm comparing the Northwest to something with a real-time wholesale market like the California ISO. And I'll try to come up with some better way to frame this later. All right. So
kind of the typical terminology that's used, depending on your point of view politically, sometimes is is the more pejorative term is a centralized market, and in the more benign term or kind of marketing term is a organized market. So so you might consider that as the alternative to a bilateral market. But they're both markets.
No, that's great. Yeah, I appreciate that. That's good stuff. Okay. All right. So one of the things I realized in conversations is I think, there's a question about, well, what do utilities do in those, as you're describing a centralized market or an organized market. So, they still perform an IRP. They still need to be individually resource adequate, still need to individually be meeting their policy requirements, and they might go out and procure or establish a contract for some energy resource, often a contract for difference price hedge. Deliver energy at $40 per megawatt hour January of next year, just to provide some stability in there. We'll talk about what the market would do with that later. But anyway, could do that for energy, could do that for resource adequacy. Maybe you have some old kind of rickety plant that you don't want to be running all the time because it's expensive, but maybe you're willing to help them meet the revenue requirement and just have them sitting there as a capacity resource that doesn't get dispatched much. Or RECs, or renewable energy credits, depending on your need. But at the end of the day, regardless of all of those positions that, or acquisitions and contracts, bilateral contracts that the utility might sign in those organized markets, at the end of the day, the market dispatches resources based on price. And unlike the Northwest, where you have all of this, long-term firm, conditional firm, hourly firm, non-firm, there are no transmission reservations prior to the day-ahead market bid submission in a centralized market. So if you have a PPA or you're a renewable resource, that might change how you bid. You might bid a little bit negative if you're a wind plant because of the PTC, for example, but it doesn't create any priority in the scheduling other than just whatever your bid is. So just to put that in kind of a more detailed look, so if you think about, so again, this is framed after the California ISO, but think about the day-ahead market there. So you have all resources in the ISO footprint, regardless of their contract status or whatever. This is a little idealized. There's obviously people or traders here trying to make more money, whatever, but just to kind of put this in general terms. So all resources in the entire footprint bid their cost. Even those that are really expensive and probably aren't going to get selected, they should bid their cost. This is idealized. And then parties outside of the ISO, like, PowerX or the Mid-Seas or, anybody else who wants to participate, they would submit a megawatt schedule either through an e-tag or they could have this kind of secondary idea. I mostly put this in there for later reference, as in it could be an intertie resource. We won't worry about that too much. But at the end of the day, the day-ahead market processes all the bids and the anticipated load, and they create what's called a base schedule, and that doesn't pay, again, any attention to anything other than price in a broad sense. And it's just looking at all the resources in the footprint and the amount of load it has to serve. And the computer, kind of that marketing piece is thinking about making sure that there's no transmission overloads, but it's not thinking about transmission contracts because they don't exist. So once you have that base schedule in the day-ahead market, you get to the real-time market, or the 5-minute market, or the EIM, or all the same thing. And resources can just say, look, this is my schedule from day ahead. Day ahead should cover and meet the obligation. So actually, let me back up. The day ahead market should meet the obligation for the next day. And then the real-time market is just meant to deal with deviations around that, a little more load, a little less wind, so on and so forth. So a resource could say, look, I'm just going to carry my schedule forward from the day before. There'll be a price taker, whatever the market clears at, that's what they get, but that's what they could do. They could also competitively bid. It just happens to be the case, you look kind of in the bottom, this is mostly just for a side reference, but it happens to be the case that about 2/3 of participants say, I'm satisfied with what I got in the day ahead. I'm just going to push that forward, and whatever the price is, that's what I'll deal with when it comes. And about another third, mostly gas plants, say, look, I'm going to competitively bid and try to make a little bit more money in here. We could talk more about this later, spend more time on the details, but I don't think this is relevant for this. The only thing I would just flag is, so, a lot of the price spikes that you see is in the real-time market because it's a little bit less liquid since you don't have as many competitive bids. 2/3 of people are already self-scheduled price takers, and also you don't have kind of financial players in there. It's all physical. But one thing I want to mention, this is because we're in the Northwest and we're talking about somewhere to the south of us. So the EIM, just to state how this has impacted that. So the EIM basically allows, non-market participants, right? I mean, by definition, if you're in the EIM, you're not in that day ahead, market as a kind of individual resource fitting in there. The EIM has basically enabled those people who are participating in that to just be redispatched around. If you have a lower cost resource, than what the market has, they'll dispatch you. If the market is oversupplied, they'll not dispatch you. So why that's been helpful is through the EIM, the shape of imports now matches the price shape or the net load shape in California. But we could spend a lot of time talking about that. I think about that a lot. But what I really would just emphasize here is all resources bid. Some of them bid competitively. Some of them just say, here's my schedule. My traders have already, I'm up in mid-Columbia. My traders have already thought about how many megawatts we think we want to offer in here. And, we think we're going to get a good price. We're just going to be price takers with whatever the market clears at. But most people bid competitively. There's no transmission reservations. Once you're on the grid, you can submit a bid. You might get selected. You might not. But that's all handled automatically. Okay, so let me just stop here. To see if anybody strongly disagrees with anything here. I know we could add a lot of nuance. I don't want to get bogged down on this here too much. But are there any kind of fundamental things that someone either disagrees with or wants to make absolutely sure that get in this conversation? Okay, so just to draw this as a different picture, right? So if you think about a single utility, you picture those couple of resources that we had. So that was that kind of blue box I was saying maybe it was hydro, it's least expensive dispatch. So it might be partially competitive bid, maybe from in-state hydro resources, and then might be price taking self-schedule, maybe a mid-Columbia type operator, something like that, submitting a bid. Then you might have this like, rickety old plant that's very expensive, but that probably could, might need to be on the grid to help a utility be resource adequate. They might have a contract that helps to keep that plant online and operating, but that doesn't mean that the plant's ever going to run. That plant still has to submit a bid that reflects its cost, and it might just never be selected. It might just get paid to be there and never ever run, which is fine. And we do that here in the Northwest. We just don't have it, in a transparent way. There are many plants in the Northwest that rarely run, and that's fine because most days aren't peak days. You want your cheap stuff to run on the other days. So if we go back down, and think about that green box in a market, and this isn't just like just to back up here. I mean, I want to just reflect this because I want to think about how we should do this in planning context. I want to just for people to be able to understand what it is that we're kind of implying when we make certain decisions. So if you think about that least cost resource or that green resource that's a cheap resource in a market, it doesn't need a PPA. It doesn't need it could have one, but doesn't need them. Doesn't need firm transmission. As soon as it's on the grid, it can be a market participant, and it could be dispatched or it might not. And that's all just based on its price. There's nothing to do with any deal, anything. And so if you think about, so what would get taken? So if this is the demand, kind of on the y-axis, and the dispatch price there is as it was before, and the market clears somewhere in the middle of that yellow, regardless of PPA, and then again recognizing there's no transmission, that green thing will get built. And that's basically, just to kind of put this into perspective now, that's basically what we're saying when we run a model that doesn't take into account all of these contracts. We are basically choosing to reflect this as our system, regardless of whether or not that's what we actually have. So just a few things to note. So all market participants, whether resources or generators, all had access to the entire footprint. Whatever the lowest cost resource in the whole footprint is dispatched first. I didn't talk about this a lot, but in general, the mechanism to kind of recognize that there are some transmission constraints is through a congestion price that might push a resource out of the money and let some other resource that's maybe on its own terms a little bit more expensive, but when you take into account transmission. It's the least cost way to solve this. Those get dispatched first, and then a couple of key highlights. The utilities don't get any preferential dispatch, none of their resources. They don't own or contract for transmission. Neither did the generator. Nobody owned or contract for transmission. And I didn't emphasize this too much, but the cost of transmission is not included in any way when thinking about the resource dispatch. The CAISO uses what's called a postage stamp approach for every megawatt hour, regardless of where it's coming from or where it's going to, and actually it's paid by the utility. So that's quite a difference than what we have here in the Northwest, where if you're coming out of Montana, you have to get a postage stamp in every single place you go through. It can really add up and make your bid less competitive than someone else who doesn't have to pay that. In the ISO, nobody pays it. Okay, so again, just to emphasize, so for planning in the model, this idea is really kind of the let's let the model do what's physically possible, and I think now we've all seen what that's implicitly assuming about our transmission system. It's implicitly assuming it's based on the physical limit, which we just showed earlier has a whole bunch of opportunity, whereas actual acquisition is based on the contractual availability. Okay, so what would that have looked like in the Northwest? So in the Northwest, just like in the market, a resource still has to go through an interconnection request, interconnection process to get onto the grid. That's, obviously, I think that makes sense to everybody. But in the market, if you had that, you're done. But in the Northwest, now you have to go through this kind of parallel process. It can be terrible. I mean, both of these processes actually, frankly, can be bad, but you have to go through this parallel process to get that transmission service. It's not just about interconnection. You also need those firm transmission rights. You need that here. You just don't need that if you don't have this market. You just don't. So just two last slides on this kind of idea. So when you think about those transmission service requests, here's a major problem with this, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to emphasize is, so just looking at BPA, not to pick on them, but just because they own the majority of transmission in the Northwest. So they use a cluster study approach, so where they kind of group together projects in a similar area. But here's the problem. So as a transmission provider, they can't make judgment calls on which projects in that group are going to move forward, or even how many of them are going to move forward. They either process them one at a time, which is what a lot of utilities do, and assume everybody that they've processed before is going to show up. Or if you're doing the cluster, you assume everybody's coming online together. So if you have a 100 megawatt RFP for one single utility, you're going to get thousands of megawatts probably of resources who want to bid and compete for that. And since we basically assume that they have to have transmission, all of them are going to go into this queue. And the problem is the study will look at, well, it looks at through the lens of an assumption that they're all going to show up. So let's imagine there's 99 megawatts of transmission or capacity that could be sold. This study doesn't show, well, here's what you need to get one more megawatt to meet that 100 megawatt RFP that everybody's after. Instead, the study will say, well, sorry, we can't make any offers. That can't be preferential. We can't make any offers, but here's how we would need to upgrade the system to account for all 1,000 megawatts of you, even though no matter what happens, only 100 are going to show up. That is a problem. So I'll just leave it at that. It's a problem. But for whoever gets it, once they get it, where a market uses computer models to kind of continuously maintain a least cost reliable dispatch. In the Northwest, we use this point-to-point thing. That's where I was describing the point of receipt and point of delivery. Which you can redirect, but won't worry about that too much. The problem is in the Northwest, those point things aren't across the entire Northwest. They're just on the one single person's transmission network, and you have to pay each of them that you went through. That's what I was describing, the kind of the, what we call the pancake, right? You have to pay the postage stamp fee for everybody. And I put a generalized formula for about how much they add up to. But basically for every kilowatt month, you're adding, some, depending on how much you run, you're adding, probably between $2 and $6 to what will be your PPA price. That makes a big difference from a competitiveness standpoint, and that's one of the things that drives what resources show up in the Northwest. It's implicit in the way that we, buy and sell transmission here, even though we don't kind of recognize it and talk about it here. So finally, just so an example, I was really bummed because I actually was planning to put this, or had this in my deck, and then I saw someone, and I thought it was pretty clever, but then I saw someone at the commission workshop use it yesterday too, so I'm not the only one who's had this. But this is just a look from PGE's 2016 IRP showing their transmission rights. It's essentially just to emphasize that what I've been showing here and trying to characterize, it's not this kind of made up thing, it's not analyst world. These are real contracts that really do, correspond to a point of receipt at a resource, a point of delivery at a utility, moving through these flow gates, all these contractual problems that we have here. This is just, PGE's position reflecting all of that, right? So coal strip moving through all of the flow gates on its way to PGE's load, that's point to point, and that's, that's sold. So that's just what it is. Even if you put a resource that was free right next to it, it would not be able to sell any energy to it, just wouldn't. Okay, so back to this kind of idea. So, we talked about how this would be dispatched in a market. So in the bilateral Northwest with limited commercial inventory, I think the simple answer is, and maybe people think this is a stretch, but I think it's reasonable. The resources that end up getting built are the ones that have transmission rights. I just gave an example where you could plop down a fictitious resource that was the cheapest source of energy around, in the middle of the summer or whatever, maybe $5 a megawatt hour. But if it had to rely on non-firm transmission, there is no guarantee that it would be the resource that gets built. Number one, because, it might not be financed by the developer because, if you're non-firm and you don't have your rights, you don't make any money. Whereas in the ISO, if you're cheap, you're going to get dispatched pretty much all the time. And then, on the other hand, too, so utilities are also on this end. It's not just about the developers. Utilities are also, I think, rightly suspicious of or want to see diligence done on these non-firm deals, because if you're relying on this resource and the resource has no control over its deliverability, and there's not a central coordinator to make sure everybody's in good shape, you could be, in a tight spot. Okay, so I was just trying to characterize kind of what we are discussing when we, what we're implying when we make the modeling assumption that, look, whatever's out there physically is out there. So I've showed what's physically out there in Washington. We're about to look at what's physically out there in Oregon. Essentially what we're implying is something that looks like a market. That's what our models, all of our models, I think, are doing when we're planning. And in the actual reality, the actual commercial environment, that may be very, very different than what ends up getting built. And that's what I was trying to kind of demonstrate there. So before I get into the trends of power flow in Oregon and the interties, which are my last two things before conclusions, should be not too much time. I wanted to see if there's any conversation or feedback about this last segment.
This is Ken. I think that, as we move more and more to variable resources and try to get to 100% renewable, and I think even higher than 100%, because we have to decarbonize transportation and manufacturing and all that. It's really increasingly obvious that this firm point-to-point transmission model that we have doesn't really work very well for the system we have, especially as we move to more variable resources. And one solution, I guess, by implication in your presentation, is going to an organized market. But the problem seems to me to be more around financial, the ability to finance a project, given the risk involved in adopting transmission that's less than firm. And that the solution to that, although an organized market is one solution, another solution might be just to have some sort of indemnification fund, so that you get on as, maybe instead of point to point, you're an energy resource, and you you deliver power on as transmission is available, and if you're congested, you've bought into some fund that's regional or state or whatever, and if you can't deliver, then you're made whole from the fund, and you pay some premium that's based on where you are and where you're planning to deliver. And I just, there isn't any discussion of that. And the issue I have with it is that the transmission system that we have is more and more broken. Insisting on firm point to point for a resource with a 20 or 30% capacity factor is just short of insane. But I think that there are solutions that we should be investigating. And I don't know that that's the council's job, but I think to build into the model the notion that these resources absolutely can't get built unless they have firm transmission, looking out 20 years is probably also not quite right.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I thought, you know, I thought that was really clear. Okay, well, if there's no other discussion, let's kind of look at that last piece, which is the Oregon piece. I'm not going to spend as much time on this because I think the pictures say it all. So this again is that same thing. Here are your flow gates. We're going to focus on this, you know, kind of Portland area, coming out of the Tacoma area down, just for folks who are, you know, don't live up here, coming out of that last Fall River. So now we're going to look at South Ballston here, across Cascade South, which is the kind of the Oregon portion of that, and then, you know, dumping out of Oregon at the interties we'll get to. So Oregon from, so here's that same plot. So this is the red lines are again kind of a look at the transmission system, very generalized. For example, you'll notice there's nothing going to the coast. That's fine. I'm trying to tell a story here, not, you know, give you an accurate picture of the transmission system. But in general, you've got flows of energy coming from the north somewhere through South Ballston, mostly north-south, and they are way lighter in the winter than the summer. Way lighter. We'll see that in a second. Then it flows over the Oregon Cascades, which are always towards the Willamette Valley, central, you know, western Oregon, the coast, whatever you want to say. Lowest in the summer, but not by a ton. And then we're dumped down to California, the Coy and PUCI. Fred had brought this up earlier. We'll talk about it a little bit when we get there. Those flows are almost always north to south in California, but Fred did some really interesting analysis. I don't want to represent it, Fred did it, but showing that there are some scenarios that we have going on right now where it's unusually trending in the other direction. Okay, so just to look at this, so here's south of Alston. So this is, you know, this is the big pinch point. You know, this is the thing that is everybody has been really worried about, and I think the first thing I would say is it is so lightly loaded a lot of the year. You know, if you think about it, if you had a term firm product, right? So if you could buy a product that was firm Q1, Q2, and Q4 and just forget about summer, right? If you're like Montana wind or something, like you'd probably be fine. It is very lightly loaded most of the year. But summer peaking path, it's mostly serving the Willamette Valley and the exports from mostly out of BC and elsewhere, the Upper Columbia Hydro. Its TTC is 3,200. It right now has long-term firm inventory just released. This again, just to quickly emphasize, it was just released, which tells you this. It tells you that you have to recognize we are talking about humans making assumptions about what contingencies could take place. We're back in that, you know, kind of that world that I described initially. You know, the fact that you can say, what actually happened here is they said, you know, there's this like a contingency scenario that's been limiting on the path. It's actually really unlikely, like, you know, we'll not worry about it anymore. I mean, that's an overstatement, actually. I mean, but that's essentially what happened. And now we have hundreds of megawatts. You just have to understand, we're talking about assumptions here in models on the single worst hour of the year with assumed contingencies and so on. You know, it makes a difference. So there's hundreds of megawatts available right now. If I was going to bet, those hundreds of megawatts will be gone very soon. But anyway, and again, that's not because I think things necessarily coming north to south. It's just, you know, you have kind of that flow, it goes anywhere it wants to go, and you have to account for that and remove some of that ATC when you're making those offers, even if it doesn't directly go through South Ballston on the contract path. But this plot down here at the bottom is that same one, just showing, basically 2015, a little bit tight, but most of the time there's 100%. Most years there's 600 plus megawatts 100% of the time, or at least 95% of the time. Okay, and then from the east, this is the Cross Cascades East coming from, so kind of this mountain here is Mount Hood. This is the gorge. This is like the Detroit Lake area, if you're from up in this area. This is it's pretty remarkable. There's always hundreds of megawatts of unused capacity here, hundreds of megawatts of unused capacity. And again, look, I mean, you have to recognize, it could very well be the case, and there is hundreds of megawatts of long-term firm inventory that could be sold here. It's not like, people just haven't realized this. The problem is it's not like someone in Eastern Oregon can say, oh, look, I just only want to use that long-term firm inventory to go to Portland. That's not how it works. That might be your contract path, but if your energy is actually going through south of Alston and there's nothing available in south of Alston, you don't get any of this. That's where you end up in these scenarios. All right, and then just to look at the ties. This section is just a little bit different because I know that the ties are kind of different beasts. So the COID, the California Oregon intertie, 4,800 megawatts, TTC. It's ATC north to south. So the available transmission capacity for long-term firm sales is 0 megawatts, and then south to north, 1,000 plus. There's a story that we, buy a lot of energy, from them to help us with our winter. That is not true. We almost never send energy south to north. We almost always, if you picked a year and said, take a bet, do you think there was a single hour where we imported energy from California? I would bet that we did not, knowing nothing about the year. And then the PDCI from kind of the Dalles, where that dam is, down to Los Angeles, substantially derated in the winter, but it's 3,200 megawatts in the summer. And again, nothing there north to south. So let me just show you, in the interest of keeping things really fun and exciting, here's the COI. In this case, I'm just going to show 1997 versus 2017. So 1997, don't worry about how close it is to the peak. This is just a single year. This is about the shape, right? So you can see the old classic shape, not double hump, the kind of summer, typical shape for California. Fast forward, is that 20 years? Okay, it's 20 years. Now you have that, again, that kind of solar build-out shape where you actually don't send any energy or send very limited energy in the midday. I'm not going to emphasize this too much because we have limited time, but if you want to go back and look at this, these bar charts down here are showing, in this case, it's the percentage of time with some megawatt availability, right? So this is basically saying, for example, there's 15% of the time there's at least between 0 and 250 megawatts, and then, looks like maybe a very small 2% of the time there's 3,500 megawatts. You can take a look at this later. And then I want to show the PDCI. Here's just, again, in the spirit of keeping things fun. I'm going to show an animation here. So this plot you're seeing now is what it looks like. And by the way, if you want to request any of this data from me for any path or any year, by all means, I've done it. I can email it to you quickly. So here's the PDCI. So this is what it looks like in 2017. I'm going to hit next, and you'll see this is what it looked like in 2015. For whatever reason, the transfer limit was lower. I can look at that. I didn't. This is just meant to be illustrative. Here's 2009. I think this is a part of why you see sales limited in the way they are. One single year doesn't tell you the whole story. But we have to be cognizant of the fact that, we're making a lot of stuff. We're trying to account for all this variability here in our long-term firm sales offerings. So let me get to the conclusions here, since we're running a little bit short on time. So conclusion. So if you have a path with limited inventory of long-term firm transmission, there could still be substantial physical capacity most or all days or hours of the year. I want to just leave it at that. I think I've said that enough. So I said the only way to access this today is through a non-firm transmission, which is probably not financeable. I probably should have added conditional firm on here. I'll make sure to put that in there. But anyway, so the end result is, look, I mean, we could be precluding least cost resource development or unnecessarily expanding our transmission system. So if you then think about, well, even for some paths which might have some inventory of long-term firm transmission, the fact that we cluster things together or process them serially, you know, assuming everybody's going to come online together, creates a problem. That's that, you know, you have a 100 megawatt RP of 99 megawatts of ATC, and you don't respond with the build for 1 megawatt, you respond with the build for 1,000. That's a problem, right? And then even if you're a single requester, I mean, this is what we've been talking about: the study processes, the models that all the assumptions that go into this when you're marketing a long-term firm. They pick the single heaviest hour and they put contingencies in place, and that's what they test the reliability of the grid with. That's how decisions are made about inventory. So none of these things are problem. There are problems with markets, big problems with markets. I'm not trying to describe a panacea here. I'm not even arguing for it. But I just want to emphasize, you don't have this point-to-point, long-term firm, clusters in the queue for, transmission service, 1,000 megawatt build out instead of 100. You don't have that because they just don't have transmission service requests. There isn't point-to-point. And that's what our models treat the system like, even though that's not what's really going on. In the market, all you need to do is interconnect. So short of the market, there's a few things you could do. These are my ideas. If anyone has others, it's great. Conditional firm is one. Term firm is another. And then another one I don't want to spend as much time on, but you could choose a point of delivery, like a resource could drop it off at mid-C, and then a utility could pick it up at mid-C. That's not really possible right now. Bonneville wants to know specifically what utility you're going to be selling to, even if that utility has access to mid-C. So a lot of information there. I'm going to end with this slide, not because I want to talk about it. Well, actually, I'm just going to put this slide up, not because I want to talk about it, because I just want to tell you that it's there for your future reference later. I go back to this picture all the time when I can't remember how power flows. This is just a generalized map showing some of the data that I had in one thing, so you can kind of piece together the whole story with one quick look. What I really wanted to end was with this one, which is questions, comments, thoughts, other feedback.
Well, this is Fred. Just one quick thought. The market construct looks like it has a lot of advantages, and it does. But don't forget, it's very complicated. Anybody who's ever looked at the California ISO markets and how they operate things and how they deal with transmission issues, you'll learn very quickly it's a very, it's a very complicated, multifaceted thing. And while you may get more efficient use of the system overall, and I think that is at least a reasonable hypothesis, you also are exposing price risk. So I'll give an example. This morning on the energy imbalance market, reflecting probably transmission constraints somewhere in the system between 7 a.m. and 8 a.m. this morning, there were it looks like about 3 5-minute intervals where the EIM price was $1,000, which is the limit for their market. So I talked to somebody a couple of years ago who said, well, that's fine. That's the market. The market's telling us stuff. And I'm like, okay, that's good, but what is it telling us? So the next question is, if you move to a market construct and you have these potential price risks, is what do you do to mitigate them, and how does that feed back into the transmission planning and expansion process? So I just thought I'd mention that because I think that's a very new mindset if we go in that direction in the Northwest.
Hey, thanks a lot, Fred. I just want to add two comments to that. I thought that was great. Just two comments. One is just for anybody who's not familiar with the 5-minute market or the real-time market. So most of the energy clears day ahead, and people are paid. If you get so if you're a generator, you're supposed to sell 100 megawatts, and the market clears at $50. You're getting that $5,000. Period. The real-time market or 5-minute market is meant to be cleanup around that. So if you're dispatched from 100 megawatts to 101, and the price in real time is 1,000, you still get your 5,000 from before, and then that one additional megawatt gets the 1,000. And I think I just want to emphasize that for people who think that the entire, huge amount of load is clearing at these, extreme prices. And then just one other quick piece. I think it might be helpful just to mention how transmission expansion is done in the ISO. So it's supposed to be the case that there's a kind of a plan of where resources are showing up, and then from I think the CPUC and the ISO is supposed to, based on their policy targets, and I think that ISO then is supposed to issue a request for proposals to get that stuff built. I don't think we need to spend a huge amount of time talking about that. If you want to add anything, by all means. I'm not meaning to cut it short. I just wanted to add that as a small detail for folks who aren't familiar.
Well, just this is Fred, one quick response just to say, I think where this is heading is, and the point you made quite a few slides ago about, are we going to end up either overestimating what we can add, especially for new renewables, given the transmission situation, state of play, you could either overestimate or underestimate what we might be able to add given these different factors, and that's going to be a big thing for the 2021 plan, because we're moving pretty rapidly from a situation, or maybe have already moved from a situation where you had relatively long build resources, and you'd have enough time to plan out the transmission for it. And now we're getting into an increasingly short time horizon for new resources, where the current constraints on transmission are going to play a bigger role. And then, how is the council going to reflect all of that in the 21 planning process?
So thank you, Fred. That is very helpful that you say that, and the reason is because that's what we're, why I brought it to the group. I didn't mean to make this a market pitch. I just want to make sure people understand what it is that we're describing when we're making a decision about that. But we recognize that. It's not something that we've taken on in the past, that concept. I'm not sure that any utilities have, but I think we recognize we probably need to do something about it. Okay, and then just one quick comment from the chat. So just someone said, well, can we describe what the product is in the EIM? Maybe emphasizing that maybe the product is not wholesale energy, and I think probably what that comment is getting at is the EIM is meant to be a very, a cheap way to balance your resources. If you have deviations from your expected load, if you have deviation from your expected solar resource, the intent of the EIM is to give you a least cost way to deal with what you might have had to deal with otherwise. So rather than turning on your peaker for $15,000 on start cost, perhaps you can pay $1,000 in the EIM to get some energy when the market's tight. Hope I characterized the intent of that comment correctly.
This is Jillian, too. Just to, as we conclude here, we've had a few questions about whether these slides are available. They have been posted to the GRAC meeting page for this particular webinar, so the slides are available. And then there's also a recording that's been going on that it links the audio with the slides as they progress. Chad, when is that available?
I can have it available within about a half an hour after this meeting.
Okay, and that'll be posted on the same GRAC meeting page?
We typically don't post the videos, but if you guys think this is a good one to do so, we will happily do so.
We'll post it.
I think this is, So, I'll send a note out to the GRAC as well. And
like I said, videos for any advisory committee meeting are always available on request.
Right. Okay, so we'll have the recording posted on the meeting page as well. For any of you who want to give it another go, or for others who have missed it.
So for people who don't want to do that, let me just
play it
be respectful of time, because I know it's 3:30. The last thing I'd say is, if you have any feedback, thoughts, or reactions that maybe you didn't want to share publicly, or just that you develop over the weekend or you can always email me or just give me a call. I'm happy to talk about it. I look forward to talking about it. So since we're at time, I think we can wrap up and conclude. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining, and we'll look forward to more discussions on this as we kind of dig further into the 2021 plan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Bye.